morning. It's good to have all of y'all here today on this webinar. My name is Elizabeth McCarty. I'm with the University of Georgia, and I'm introducing Dr. Jay Shelton. He is a fisheries biologist with the Warnell School of Natural Resources at the University of Georgia. This is the third in a 5-part series discussing ecosystem management in urban forest. The first 2 webinars are available on Forestry Webinars as recordings. That's one on insects of trees in urban forest. The second one was on successful tree planting. Today we have the forest-water interface. Tomorrow we will talk about invasive species. And on Friday, Dr. Chris Irwin will speak about environmental education in urban areas. So I will turn this over to Dr. Shelton. My last comment will be that if you notice at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A and a chat. If you have questions for Dr. Shelton, please put them in the Q&A section so we don't lose them in the chat. And at the end of the webinar, we'll get to those questions. All right, it's all.
All right, can somebody let me know whether you can hear me or not?
Yep.
All right, and is my video looking okay?
Yep.
Great. Well, greetings to you all. As Dr. McCarty said, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the forest-water interface and try to look at the big picture scale with respect to not just the aquatic resources themselves, but the watersheds that surround and maintain those aquatic resources. So real quickly, a little bit about me. I am on faculty in the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources. So I teach several different classes. So I get a lot of contact with college students of various ages and from various disciplines. I do, as most of us here in Warnell, as much hands-on, what now is called experiential learning as possible when it comes to teaching. So we do try to keep our students actively engaged in real-world management issues, real-world management applications. Most of the ones that I'm involved in involve water in one way or another. So one of the things I tell my students, but it really doesn't just apply to students, I think it really applies to the topic this week, is that when it comes to ecology, everything is connected and nothing stays where we put it. And I think that statement is gonna kind of become apparent as we go through this lecture. But in ecology, we sort of split the entire environment up into different spheres. And of course, those spheres being water and air and soil and all of the living critters that encompass a given ecosystem. And that really, in addition, as I say, in addition to teaching, kind of is a fundamental thing, I think, to keep in mind for the purposes of what we're going to talk about this week. And so few of the things that I do in addition to teaching, however, that have a direct role in what we're going to talk about today. I do work a lot with both private landowners and with resource agencies and others on various aspects of fisheries management, and that includes small impoundments. And as you all know, many small impoundments, ponds, if you will, dot the landscape in most of our states and most of our ecosystems, and they are a resource that we used to think of, and down here in Georgia frequently were referred to as farm ponds. But in reality, very few of those impoundments now are on farms, and many of them are actually in either suburban or urban areas. So things have changed a lot with respect to the landscape. And so on that topic, in terms of my outreach responsibilities, I do interact a lot with people on issues with regards to construction, to renovation, to various other questions about that particular aquatic resource. And I must point out that there are numerous, and many of you know this, numerous laws and various agencies that regulate the construction of impoundments. And at the top of that list for private landowners for certainly would be the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, but also with respect to the historic construction and utilization of those impoundments, that would include the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And in addition to that, whatever state you're in, there are also state and local agency folks that are involved in responsible for protection of the environment who have a lot to say about activities in aquatic areas, including ponds. So make sure before you take any action, you check with the appropriate regulatory agencies. And I will say that over the years, that has gotten more and more complicated, and we must not forget about that. It's no longer okay to beg for forgiveness. All right, so another thing that I've been doing in recent years at a larger scale, but related to fisheries and related to watersheds, is working in the area of aquatic connectivity, and that's a topic that I think we hear more about. Aquatic connectivity could include, for example, this project that worked on in 2018, which was a dam removal project. It turns out that we, as in the University of Georgia, owned a dam, which we chose to remove because it was obsolete. And as a result of that, we worked on some guidelines for the removal of dams in Georgia. And through a national network, there is a lot of information available on dams, including information on obsolete dams. Thankfully, if anybody's interested, we can revisit that. But for the issues of aquatic connectivity, and I mentioned dam removal, but aquatic connectivity can mean other things. For example, if you're a private landowner or if you manage private lands, you may have installed or have had for you installed culverts. And culverts are another potential issue, if not properly installed and properly maintained and properly sized, another potential issue of aquatic connectivity. And a third area of aquatic connectivity that I'm going to talk a little bit about later is the area of what's called lateral connectivity, or, in its simplest terms, stream restoration for the purposes of connecting streams back to the watersheds that they, to the floodplains that they are surrounded by. On the broad scope, our water resources, of course, include very small perennial streams and intermittent streams, and even ditches and canals, and also ponds, impoundments on the landscape. But at a larger scale, we would pull in wetlands and estuaries and even coastal waters, just depending on where you are. And from a legal perspective, there's a little three-letter word, use, that matters a lot when it comes to the legal protection of our aquatic resources, whether they be public or private, because as we said at the beginning of the show, everything is connected. So legal definitions or legal designations, if you will, that determine the appropriate condition, in other words, the quality of water in the United States, include things like designated as a drinking water supply, designated for recreation, designated for fishing, and for others. And so each of those definitions, whatever the definition or the designation, excuse me, whatever the designation is, determines what the appropriate or proper conditions are for that water body. And with those designations in mind, a fairly recent report on the condition of our aquatic resources, and in particular this assessment was focused on streams and rivers, found that many of our streams and rivers are impaired in one way or another. Here you see it says 46% of nations' rivers and streams are in poor biological condition, 25 in fair, 28 in good condition. So what does that mean? Well, it of course is a cause for concern nationally with respect to these resources that provide us with so many important ecological services. Here it mentions things like loss of fishing and loss of recreational opportunities, but we must recognize that our waters, the waters of the United States, provide us a tremendous amount of other ecological services, including industrial use, including drinking water, including irrigation, and many other uses. So but another thing to consider is that we have, of course, modified the landscape for many, many, many decades. And we've put impoundments of all sizes, everything from big mainstream reservoirs on down to very small farm ponds. Those modifications in basically are throughout the landscape. And so we ask the question, what are the condition of our rivers and streams? Well, we should also ask the question, what are the condition of our impoundments? If you think about that for a minute, I know that there's a lot of different answers, but one thing that is important to remember is many of them are really old. And regardless of other ways that you can characterize them, their age is definitely something that we need to consider because as with all other resources and infrastructure, they need to be maintained in a sustainable way. And that'll come back and we'll talk about it a little bit later. But when we talk about these designations and we talk about especially the regulatory designations, how do we know the condition of a given body of water? Well, we think of it in terms of a few different ways to assess it. One big one is water quality. And for those of you who are foresters, you know that we spend a lot of time talking about water quality BMPs. But the fundamental definition of water quality really is the same, regardless of whether we're talking about water quality BMPs for forestry, et cetera. But when we get into the urban context, which is kind of where we're heading here, we need to keep this in mind. But it's very simple. It's the physical, chemical, and biological attributes that affect the suitability for water for a given use. So we go directly back to that three-letter word use when we talk about water quality. But in addition to water quality, other ways that we assess the conditions in any body of water, whether it be a stream that's on your property, or whether it be a pond that was constructed on your property or that you have land adjacent to, or whether it be a big reservoir that you utilize. We look at habitat. We focus on basically on the condition of the natural constituents of the home or environment for particular organisms that we're interested in. Those organisms, of course, could be fish, and frequently, that's the ones that people pay a lot of attention to, but there are lots of other types of habitat assessments that can be done. For example, we might look at a wetland and use a habitat assessment tool to determine whether if it's good habitat for something like wood ducks or even beavers for that matter. And then the final part of this, which is what I spend a lot of time doing, is what's called biological assessment, where we actually use some form of living organism to tell us about the conditions in a given water body, whether it be a lake or a stream or a wetland or an impoundment. So biological assessment is something I'll talk a little bit about here for a minute, if you bear with me. One of the things, and many of you have heard of this, is that we do is what's called a benthic macroinvertebrate biological assessment. Now, if you look at this slide and the picture that's on the left, all the stuff in there you could think of as aquatic critters or aquatic bugs, or some of you might think of it all as fish bait. But those benthic bottom-dwelling macroinvertebrates do tell us a good bit about conditions in a given body of water. And then the other thing that is very common, and all states in the United States now have a program to do this, is what's called a fish bioassessment. And a fish bioassessment I'll talk about for a second as well. But the bottom line is that what we're looking for here, in many states it's called an index of biological integrity. What we're really looking at here is not individual species, but the entire community, and whether or not that fish community has all the different pieces that should be there. And so when I say different pieces, I mean different species. And we know that some species of fish are more pollution sensitive, some species of fish are more pollution tolerant, but we should have both. There should be a appropriate level of diversity in any given aquatic habitat. And so what we do is we use various sampling methods to not just assess individual species, but to assess the entire fish community. And then we can make some inferences about the overall ecological health. That needs to be based on regional conditions. And so I'm using Georgia here as an example because that's where I am. And the regional conditions will be totally dependent on where you are. But there's this term ecoregion, or some people use the term physiographic province. Here in Georgia, we have these different ecoregions of the state. So obviously geography matters a lot. For example, we would not compare a stream that's in the coastal plain down in South Georgia to a stream that's up in the Ridge and Valley province of North Georgia. We would not compare, drainage basin also matters. So we would not compare a second order or a small stream to a fourth order or a medium-sized stream. So we try not to compare apples and oranges here when we do this kind of work. And for any given area, there are what are designated or called reference streams. In other words, from the resource professionals sampling those areas, what are the best existing conditions? It's not like we can go around and find pristine environments to make these comparisons. So what we usually call them is minimally impaired. And so we basically give things a score based on these comparisons in terms of the fish community for everything from very poor to excellent. And a very similar concept, very, very similar, is done with bugs. The combined information that we can gather from the benthic macroinvertebrates and the fish really give us a full picture. One of the reasons we try to do both is that fish tend to be longer lived and more mobile. They can move more and they live longer. And so they kind of represent a longer scale video of what's going on in a given water body. And then benthic macroinvertebrates can move around. You know, some of them have adult forms that can fly, others can't. And so they give us a different time scale, a different geographic scale picture, and combine those two, and we get a really good idea of how healthy or not healthy a given body of water is. And we can try to relate all that back to different sources of impairment. And here are just some of the ones that I threw out here. Certainly here in Georgia, one of our biggest concerns, one of our major sources of impairment, recognized sources of impairment, is sedimentation. If any of you are private landowners or land managers, you have probably seen and had to deal with issues associated with sedimentation. There are other factors that affect fish and macroinvertebrate communities, and in all honesty, it's almost never one. It's almost never one of these. It's usually the cumulative effects of multiple stressors that has a negative impact on aquatic health. And so, starting from the well-defined perennial streams, and some of you may be lucky enough to have a view like this on your property or on property that you manage. Obviously, in these streams, because there's water flowing year-round, they tend to develop these diverse, robust aquatic organisms that are easy to sample, but that's not the only water resource that we pay attention to and that we should care about. For example, intermittent streams, which can have a well-defined channel, but might only flow during wet seasons, are equally important in many ways because they tend to be quite vulnerable to soil erosion and transport issues. And some of you may be currently dealing with these types of issues on land that you own or that you manage. But the bottom line here with that, and certainly it's not necessarily the top priority in every state, but there are many states where sediment erosion and transport is a major concern. So anytime we create bare dirt, in all honesty, bare soils, you have the potential to create a problem. And this is where BMPs really, really come into play. Foresters are trained on BMPs, but landowners, and as you move into urban areas, there are other types of protections and even regulations, but above and beyond BMPs, which are voluntary, that basically are all geared towards the same level, the same types of protection. And sediment is certainly one that's we focus a lot on. So we're moving towards the city. We haven't gotten into the urban areas yet, but we're moving there at a rapid rate now. And so before we get there, I wanted to point out something, and that is, why does this stuff matter? Why is this guy talking about bugs and fish when it comes to environmental health? And here's why it matters. What we know, and forgive me, these are were pulled from a document that might be a little bit hard to read, but the overall trend lines are the only thing you need to focus on. So, for example, in terms of watersheds, we see these clear relationships between the fish communities and the land use in that watershed. And so, for example, if we look at riparian forest land cover, in other words, in areas directly adjacent to water, the forest or the land right next to water, if that area is forested, if the more of the total of that area is forested, the better the fish scores, the better the fish, more healthy the fish community is. On the other hand, this is just, I'm intentionally leaving out urban areas right now because I don't want you to think that this is all either rural or urban, because there are other important land uses. On the other hand, if you look at the percent of the riparian, adjacent to the water, the percent of the area that is adjacent to the water, the more cropland, the poorer the scores. So trees good, pastures not so good when it comes to these types of metrics. And the same thing is true here. We're talking about riparian. So here we're talking right next to the stream, but here we're talking about the entire watershed. So the entire watershed down at the bottom, the same thing is true. Forested, as more forested land use you have, the better the scores. The more cropland land use you have, the poorer the scores. You know, to sum it up, the bottom line is that wood is good, and wood is good for a lot of different reasons. Now, yet I use that term riparian, which simply means right next to a stream, and I'm going to talk for a minute about different types of aquatic ecosystems. You know, I've talked a little bit about streams, a little bit about impoundments, but what kinds of activities, what kinds of things could we do if we would like to, excuse me, if we would like to see an improvement in the conditions in these aquatic areas. And that improvement might be because we care about, well, a lot of different uses, but in this case, this is an example of a project, and I'll just mention for a minute, but in this case, and in many, it's not just one use. Several of the people that are present here are talking about and interested in investing in stream restoration because they care specifically about trout fishing. This is actually a small tributary to a major trout river, the Chattahoochee River. So that might be one reason, but you know, it might just be that it's my backyard and I'm losing land. I'm literally losing my backyard at an alarming rate. That might be another reason. You might be a downstream user and you want aesthetically pleasing water. You don't want a bunch of turbidity and a bunch of silt and a bunch of sediment because you'd like it to look better. There are other people here that work for federal agencies who it's their responsibility to maintain and to care for these resources. One of the guys in this group here is a fishing guide, and he cares about it because his clients want to go fishing. So there's lots of different reasons why this kind of stuff is of interest at various levels, but it's complicated. Bottom line is it's complicated. Certainly stream restoration, like the one that I just mentioned, is a very complicated process. But unfortunately, far too many of our streams have been impaired and could benefit from restoration. So that's one area of aquatic connectivity that I work a good bit in. And certainly, I think we've got a lot to learn, but I hope, I'm excited that more attention has been focused on these types of activities in recent years, and hopefully the results will be a benefit to all of us, not just to state and federal agencies who manage the land and the water of the United States, but to those of us who are private landowners and can utilize what's being learned and what's being made available on our own private resources. Because as I said, everything is connected. So now we're finally getting back down to, you know, we got to the city now. And this is actually a piece of a watershed that is well, this particular one is in Columbia County, so it's adjacent to the city of Augusta. And when we talk about watershed management, the best way I can think of to describe it is to say that an urban watershed, but really most of our watersheds are like a quilt. Okay, and you have to recognize that here we have, I hope you can see my cursor. If you can, we'll have 3 different watersheds here. So we've got this little creek down here called Little Haynes Creek. And here are all, oh, where's my cursor go? Here are all of the little streams that connect together and all flow into Little Haynes Creek. Over here, we've got Big Flat Creek. So here we've got a small area, all of which flows down into the same point. And then up here, we've got Big Flat Creek, the other part of Big Flat Creek. And before all that joins together, we've got this other watershed over here. What I'm trying to show here is that when I say a quilt, what I mean is there are multiple layers. So we've got the stream layer, we've got the sewer layer, we've got the roads layer, and we've got the land use layer. And if you can, and thankfully now we have the capacity to do this, if you can put all these layers together, you can make some decisions about where the likely sources of impairment are, where we're going to get probably see problems versus where we won't, and what that can help to do is to give us a better understanding of how to make decisions at that watershed scale, recognizing that much of what we do on dry land has an impact on the conditions in our waters, in our aquatic resources, whether it be ponds or streams. So well, I've added another layer here. You see that we talked before about things like sewers and roads, but here I've added land cover. And you'll see that when we talk about an urban stream, we still have trees and we still have pasture land. So that's what I mean when I say a quilt or a patchwork. You know, it's a bunch of pieces all put together, and very few watersheds are all the same. So here you see these, this is color coded. So the red areas are developed, and the darker the red, the more intensive the development. And then the darker green areas are forested, the pale green areas are pasture land. So again, we've got this mixture. The other thing that we can do then is to think about what is the most critical piece, what's the most vulnerable piece, I guess is the best way to do it. And that allows us to put together a priority index. So we've used all the information from those other two slides to come up with this. And the simple, whoops, sorry, go back. The simple take-home message here is that green is an area that is probably in good condition and we don't need to worry about it as much, but red is an area that's highly vulnerable, and we should be very careful and consider that to be the areas that are most in need of protection. And it's no surprise here, but the areas along the streams are the areas that are highest priority. And so you know, this is one of those situations where we've got to balance everybody's, well, as I usually put it, try to keep everybody involved equally unhappy, because it's impossible to keep everybody happy. So here is one of those priority areas, those red areas, which are high priority. And it doesn't really look like it, but this is actually a small stream. It's a small stream in an urban area. And if you take a closer look at that small stream, you'll see that it might have some issues. And some of these issues involve what's going on upstream, which is some recent construction. Some of these issues involve the way it's currently being managed, which is they try to put the bush hog right on down into the stream and keep it mowed right down to the ground, as opposed to trying to protect that riparian buffer that we talked about earlier. And as you kind of put all this stuff together, hopefully, as we put all this stuff together, that original, you know, thing that I put up there, where how everything is connected and nothing stays where we put it, that's just kind of the whole take-home message when it comes to managing our aquatic resources, whether it's a stream, whether it's a farm pond, whether it's an urban amenity pond, a neighborhood pond. What happens upstream of you matters to you, and what you do, what happens on the area of the stream or the pond that you manage matters downstream. And that's true for all of the four spheres that we've discussed here, and in particular, it is true for the degree to which the soil, the land, is directly connected to the hydrosphere or the water, because all of these intimate connections. So I hope that has made a little bit of sense. I hope that and I realize we covered a lot of ground. I realize it was pretty, realize it was, what do they say, an inch deep and a mile wide. But if there's any specific aspects of watershed protection or aquatic connectivity that you'd like to discuss, we've got some time and we could certainly do that now.
All right, please put questions if you have them in the Q&A section. We'll be glad to start going through those. All right, we'll give it just another minute. If anybody would like to ask questions, just put them in the Q&A section right next to the chat. All right, we've got one. Could you please talk about pond restoration?
All right. I'll tell you, I'll start with this. And I don't know, Silvana, if you could tell us where you are, but how I would say that fortunately, there are some good resources that have been developed by the various regulatory agencies on the subject of pond restoration. It is extremely important these days because it's so expensive and it's so complicated to build new ponds. So what people are finding is that these existing ponds, as we said, a lot of them are really old, but they've become a valuable resource because it's a whole lot cheaper to take care of them and to restore them than it is to build a new one. And so the best way to start is to consult the USDA NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service office in your region. And the reason I'm going about it in that way is that things are different from state to state, and that is true for all of those regulatory agencies. Generally speaking, the good news is that generally speaking, if you stay within the existing footprint, the footprint of an existing pond, then the permitting requirements are quite simple. That's good news. The bad news is that even if you stay within the existing footprint and the permitting part is simple, unfortunately, it's not that easy to find a really good experienced contractor that is experienced in doing pond restoration. They're out there, but you really have to look. Usually your local NRCS office has contacts, has people that you can call and ask. Here's the thing I would do above all else. If this is somebody who says, yes, I can fix your pond for you, I can restore your pond, say, I want to go and visit some of the ponds that you've worked on recently. So go out and visit them and make sure that they're doing good quality work and talking to the referrals are really, really critical here. That's where I would generally start is with the NRCS office. Now there are other sources of assistance, including the state regulatory authority in our state, for example, in Georgia. It's Georgia DNR, Department of Natural Resources, EPD, Environmental Protection Division, and that would be slightly different, but every state has an environmental protection agency. And so that's another source of information. But when it comes to ponds in particular, just because NRCS was around so long and was in the pond construction business back when they were called the Soil Conservation Service, they usually have good resources for pond restoration. So that's where I would start.
All right, and that was coming from a North Carolina.
Yeah.
All right, we've got quite a few more questions coming in now. What do you talk to with cities/counties to discuss water issues?
Good, really good question. And this is where this concept of trying to build a stakeholder partnership really is critical because it's very interdisciplinary, and it is you have to. Somebody told me once it's called you have to work a miracle. It's a policy miracle because you have to put people together that don't normally work together. And so for example, the Crayfish Creek project that we were talking about, we had multiple NGOs. We had multiple, and a common example these days would be the river keepers. There are oftentimes river keepers in various areas that have a stake in aquatic resources. But then there has to be something in it for the municipality. In other words, either the county or the city has to see some benefit from this kind of work. In the example of Crayfish Creek that I gave you, this creek is in Sugar Hill, Georgia. And Sugar Hill, believe it or not, sees restoring this creek as a means of increasing the recreational use and adding to the value of what they manage and what they own. So they're 100% on board with this. So NGOs, and then of course within the municipality, it may be somebody fairly high up. In the case of Sugar Hill, it's the chairman of the board of commissioners, who's really in another city that I work in right here in Athens. We work directly with the Office of Sustainability. That's another agency that has a stake in these kinds of issues. Building this stakeholder partnership, you never know. It can be different stakeholders in different places, but it's frequently very important to get those right people on the team. Another project that just came up here in the Atlanta area, it's going to be a local watershed association who is really kind of going to be the point of that, but they don't know who on the regulatory side of things they need to talk to. So one of the things we try to do is to put them in touch with the specific how to put the right pieces together for what you're trying to accomplish.
All right, I'm going to ask a few questions because they're all related. So
okay, yeah.
All right, it's the first of three that are very similar, so they can kind of all be at the same time. As for urban stream restoration, what is the best issue to try to tackle first? Invasives, water quality, etc. The next related question are, what are the methods for restoring riparian areas, planting, reshaping stream paths? I know I see
yeah.
And the last question is, the benefits of vegetative buffer for water bodies seem to be universally known. Would you say a treed forested buffer is more efficient than that of mixed plant species? And I'm guessing mixed plant species might be mixed herbaceous plants.
Yeah. Okay.
So have at all of that.
Yeah, thank you. So I mean, and you see that Dr. McCarty is grinning too, because we're actually heavily involved in a project that encompasses all of the aspects of those three questions together. And I mean, honestly, to me, the first thing that comes to my mind is that's a topic for another webinar or two or three or a week's worth of it. So I can tell you this, and I'm working a lot, as Dr. McCarty is now, in urban landscapes. This is the biggest challenge of all. Quite frankly, there are many people who will tell you, yes, we know how to do stream restoration. It is a very complicated process. Urban areas add an extra layer of complication. And it again requires these stakeholder partnerships that I mentioned before. I guess if this was a group and we were in a room, I would say, all right, if you are an engineer, if you are a licensed engineer, raise your hand right now. And I'm not sure if we have any or not, but I'm asking that question for a specific reason. I hate engineers. I mean, I know I shouldn't say that, and I'm only kidding to some degree, but I work with engineers these days more than I do fisheries biologists, because we depend on them for doing this type of work. From a regulatory perspective, you either have to be a certified engineer or a certified landscape architect to seal documents to do stream restoration work. Okay, so those are the folks that I work with a lot. What I try to get, the point I try to get across to them, and I'm kidding. I have some friends that are environmental engineers, and but the important part is that they need to interact with us. They need to interact with the foresters, with the fisheries professionals, with the forest health professionals like Dr. McCarty. We need to do this as a group, because engineers were never trained in ecological benefits of stream restoration that many landowners and many other groups care so much about. And so when we do this as a team, We can do it very, very effectively. And I think we can be successful. But the final thing I'll say about that is that if you were to ask, and I've done this, if you were to say, go contact 5 different consultants who do who say we do stream restoration, contact 5 of them, and you were to tell them what you want, and they were to give you a design, you get 5 very different designs. I wish at the beginning of my talk I showed you that cookbook that we tried to create for dam removal. It would be great if there were a similar cookbook for stream restoration. The problem is it would have to be enormous because there's so much variability in streams. And then if in that cookbook there was a special section on restoration of urban streams, that would still be pretty beefy. But what we're seeing is this move, hopefully this move away from what we call hardscapes. In other words, the solution to everything in stream restoration is concrete and gabion and non-native options. A movement towards what we call ecological stream restoration, which involves that other question that somebody asked, which was, what's better, trees or other? And the answer is the best possible restoration approach is one that reestablishes a fully functional riparian forest corridor. And by fully functional, I mean overstory trees, understory trees, really diverse shrub cover, really diverse native ground cover. And that, I don't know if we have anybody here from the Chesapeake Bay area, but look online at the decades of effort that have gone into watershed scale restoration in Chesapeake Bay, and look at what it's doing for them. It's a tremendous success story. It's very, very exciting. This can be done. And the other example I'll give you, because we talk about urban, look at where the water supply for the city of New York comes from. It comes from forests. Basically, if you can buy and protect forests, then cities have high quality water that they need. And we're starting to understand that. The thing is that those little bitty streams that are on private land, they matter too. This is all a part of the same network, and it is all connected.
All right, I'm going to ask these 2 questions because they may be related, they may not. First, do you see additional regulations on the horizon? And when will engineers allow us to plant trees in water retention areas?
So I guess that was not an engineer who asked that question, but I would say this. So 2 questions there, and yes, you're right, Elizabeth. They are related. But so the first one there. Well, let's see, which one should we take? So this is where what's interesting is if you had an engineer to design a project and a landscape architect design the same project, the landscape architect would put a bunch of trees in there, and the engineer probably wouldn't. A lot of this is based on we do what we're taught to do, but we need to start thinking outside the box, and that's where putting these 2 together is the best approach. That's actually what we're doing on Crayfish Creek. We've got engineers, and we've got landscape architects, and we've got ecologists, and we're all sitting down talking about the plan, and I think that's beneficial. And the other question had to do with here's what I think is going to happen. We have good regulations. It's really a part of this is about implementation, and a part of it is there are regional differences in the way those regulations are implemented. But the problem here is, if I want to do a stream restoration, which we would think of as a positive thing, I've still got to do all of the things that someone who was going to build a shopping center and a parking lot have got to do. The rules are the same, and so that's not a bad thing. We should all be held to the same standard. But the good thing is that within, a lot of these regulations all go to the Clean Water Act, and in particular, Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. One of the interesting things about the Section 404 is there are what are called NWPs, nationwide permits that have already been written for certain types of activities, and this allows us to streamline the process, and that is a good thing. It doesn't make the protection any less critical, but it allows us to streamline the process, because if it is so expensive and so difficult and complicated to get a permit, we'll never do any of this kind of work. It won't happen. So one of the goals that I've taken on in the state of Georgia here is to try to streamline that process and increase our capacity to do this kind of work. And the good thing is that there are aquatic connectivity teams in most of our states. And I know we got some folks here from Pennsylvania. They started this stuff. They're so far ahead of the rest of us. It's amazing. Another example of another state that is really, really way up there is North Carolina. I see we got some folks from North Carolina. Their aquatic connectivity teams have really led the way, and they've done a lot to help with this. If there's one national entity that can put you in touch with the folks you need to talk to on the ground in your local area, it would be it's an entity called American Rivers. And you can, I probably could put it in the chat, but American Rivers is a great place to start, regardless of what state you live in.
All right, I see that a couple of people are raising their hands. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. We're not going to be able to unmute you to ask your question. Here's a good one. How is recreational forested greenways and the urban rural forest influencing vegetation loss and erosion and sedimentation?
That is a great question, and it's a very timely question because I know here in the state of Georgia, for example, we recently passed something.
And I'll ask you, hang on, let me put this one with it because I think there's going to be some overlap.
Okay.
So how are greenways getting into sedimentation? And having lived next to an urban greenway, this next question comes up.
Okay.
Luckily, we have a growing homeless population. Many outdoor campers settle near streams and greenways as well, using the goal of managing this activity, not prohibition. What are some things as outreach volunteers that we can suggest to the campers or request from state and local officials as far as access to this outdoor water source with conservation and protection in mind? And there's also a safety issue here as well.
Yeah. Yeah, a tremendous question. You see, this just gets to when I said that when you go from a rural to an urban context, how complicated these issues become. Here's another part of it. So I'll give you I'll give you a real world example. I mentioned Athens Clarke County, which is where I'm working on a project right now, and we're working directly with the sustainability office in Athens Clarke County. And immediately on this project, we realized we need to have every other county department represented in our meetings, and that included all of the human services representatives, because of the law of unintended consequences. We think we're doing good in one area and we may be causing problems in another area. Again, when we talk about sustainability, some of you have heard this so much that I'm gonna sound really redundant, but I don't like people. I really don't. I like fish. Okay, so I come at a project from, what can we do for the fish? But I know this, there's only one way to do a sustainable project, and that is not to have conflict, but to have compromise. So you have to, if you like fish, that's the environmental concern that's my job. But I got to pull people in on that team that care about cultural and social issues, right? Because if it's sustainable for the environment, that's one thing. It's got to be culturally or socially sustainable. That's the other thing. And then we all know what the third leg of that three-legged stool is, and that's economically sustainable. And that is where the planners, the infrastructure people, the ones that actually have a budget, and they're not dependent completely on volunteers, they got to be at that same table, and we got to find a way to keep them equally unhappy.
All right, the next question is, organizational stakeholders are one thing, but do you have any guidance to provide for those dealing directly with private landowners? And I guess that also depends on in what capacity you're dealing with a private landowner.
Yeah. Again, a really excellent question, and it's a real world question that Dr. McCarty and I have to deal with all the time because, Georgia's a big state. Georgia has 159 counties. We have a lot of humans, and most of those humans are crammed into cities. So one of the ways that we work on this is through what we call the county delivery system, through the Cooperative Extension Service. So the good news is there's a county extension agent in all of those 159 counties, and frequently we work directly with them. Now, here's what can happen for private landowners. There are some incentives. There are some programs, incentive programs and benefit programs for private landowners. I'm hopeful that we will start to see more of that kind of incentive and more of those kind of benefits come about as a part of the It feels right now like we are much more, we recognize the value of infrastructure. You've heard a lot about all this infrastructure stuff. Well, yeah, you could think of infrastructure as being roads and bridges, but I think I would argue that infrastructure also includes our water. Water is an important part of our infrastructure. And in reality, when it comes to things like high quality drinking water, the forested riparian zones are an important part of that infrastructure. So I'm hopeful that we're going to see more movement towards providing incentives for private landowners. In a state like Georgia, the private forest land is an extraordinary resource. In some states, a lot of it is publicly owned, but here in Georgia, it is a mixture of both, with a big chunk of it being private. Right now, it's just really intimidating for private landowners to have the capacity that they need to do this kind of work. I hope that NRCS can help us. I hope that that Cooperative Extension Service can engage as well. And then I hope that we can see some guidance come from top down. In other words, when if the Corps of Engineers says, all right, we're going to protect the water, that's fine, and that's important, but they could also provide additional capacity for things like stream restoration, because it is such a big priority. So those are initiatives that I'm pushing for behind the scenes that I hope would benefit not just the public landowners like the National Park Service or the Forest Service, but private landowners as well.
All right, we have one more question, but we have plenty of time for questions. So if anybody else has questions, don't hesitate to put them in the chat area. And this last one, I'm going to expand a little bit because I think there's more to be said here. Can you comment on the level or degree of adverse effects of motorized recreational vehicles, power boats, 4 or 2 cycle engines on rivers and streams? And the question's not quite over yet, but I think also ATVs would be a great other item for different reasons to move into this conversation. Yeah. What value is gained by limiting or prohibiting their use to reduce petroleum pollutants in regard to water quality and survival of aquatic species? So if we can have boats on the water and then ATVs on the land.
Sure. Yeah, this is, to say that I'm an introvert is not accurate. I'm more of a misanthrope. So my outdoor recreational experiences are based on whether or not I see another human in the course of the experience. So getting back to that crazy statement I said earlier, you might have thought that was a weird way to put it, but keeping everybody equally unhappy, that's what a resource manager has to do, because every decision they make probably is going to make someone unhappy. It's impossible to to make everybody happy. So it's a very complicated balance. And when you talk about access, talking specifically about access, and you that manage private landowners, this. You can love something to death, and we've seen examples of that, where we have so many people that want to engage in a certain activity at a certain location that we see a severe degradation in the quality of that environment. And so again, we think of this big patchwork where, as an example, I'll give 2 examples. One would be this. One of the most amazing weeks of my entire life, it changed me forever, I will never forget it, was I floated for 7 days on a river in Alaska where I saw lots of grizzly bears, but no people. Okay, and that was there was limited access, so extreme limited access. Right, it was an amazing experience. You would not find me on Lake Lanier on a Saturday ever in my life, ever. Lake Lanier is a pretty lake. It's close to here. It's extremely popular for jet skis and boaters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. 2 totally different experiences. So we've got to be able to find a way to provide the opportunity for all of the people for the people that like jet skis and ATVs. We need to find that opportunity for them, but we got to balance that against it with areas where those things are restricted, acknowledging that there's an impact. And so this is where, at the national level, we work a lot right now, Dr. McCarty and I, with the National Park Service. They've got to think about access. I work a lot with Georgia Department of Natural Resources. They've got to think about access. There are places that are heavily restricted, and then there are places that have quite liberal restrictions. And it involves in this balance of keeping everybody equally unhappy.
All right, well, I think that is our last question of the day. Thank you, Dr. Shelton, for all of that increase in knowledge and answering the questions. I'd like to remind everybody that this is a 3rd in a 5-part series. So we have presentations tomorrow on invasive species in urban areas, and then Friday on environmental education in urban areas. So these all are going to be recorded and available online on forestry webinars. And thank you so much for your time. Y'all have a great afternoon.
Thank you all.